Every 80 years, a financial collapse destroys a superpower. America just crossed the point of no return. This isn't just a pessimistic prediction. This is the most reliable financial pattern in recorded history. The silent ticking of the debt clock is now in its final phase, and the United States is entering the endgame. While the mainstream media bombards us with political drama, a terrifying reality is unfolding in the financial markets. The warning signs are already here, flashing red. The wealth of the unprepared is about to be wiped out, while those who see the pattern will transfer trillions to their pockets. In this video, we're going to expose how this collapse works and why the United States is entering its final phase.
At the heart of every empire's downfall is a debt cycle, and America's debt is no exception. The cycle is predictable. Every 80 years, the empire hits its breaking point. Back in 1781, the U.S. was drowning in revolutionary debt, and its currency, the continental dollar, collapsed into worthless paper. Fast forward 80 years to 1861, and the American Civil War forces the government to once again suspend the gold standard, printing paper currency that loses its value. History repeats itself, but each time the stakes get higher. Fast forward again to 1944, after World War II, when the Bretton Woods Agreement puts the U.S. dollar at the center of the global economy. And now, here we are, on the precipice of history's final debt reset. Now, let's zoom in on the core issue that is sinking America's empire: unsustainable debt. The U.S. government has now entered the final phase of the 80-year cycle. The numbers are staggering. In 2024, the U.S. government's national debt has reached an all-time high, surpassing a jaw-dropping $38 trillion. But that's not the worst part. The real kicker is that America is now paying more interest on its national debt than it is spending on national defense. This is the death cross in financial terms. The empire is no longer investing in its strength. It is now paying rent on past mistakes. The result? The U.S. has effectively become a zombie debtor nation.
This is where history gets chillingly accurate. The British Empire, once the most dominant power on Earth, faced a similar fate. In the early 20th century, just as the United States was rising, the British Empire was crumbling under the weight of its own debt. In 1945, the UK was forced to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, begging for a bailout. Sound familiar? The same fate now threatens America. In fact, the US dollar is already in a state of decline, mirroring the path the British pound took before it. The more the U.S. prints money to cover its debts, the less valuable the dollar becomes. America is facing the same agonizing slide to the bottom that Britain did 80 years ago.
The cycle we are witnessing isn't just about economic collapse, it's about the transfer of global power. Every empire that's fallen has followed this predictable pattern. The Dutch Empire collapsed when they began relying too much on financial speculation instead of production. Similarly, the British Empire collapsed after overextending its military power and failing to manage the economic burden. And now, as the United States faces the same dilemma, the rest of the world is starting to look for alternatives to the US dollar. The BRICS nations are already working to create their own currency bypass systems, and China has already reduced its holding of U.S. Treasury bonds significantly. The writing is on the wall. The concept of a reserve currency has always been linked to economic dominance. From the Dutch guilder to the British pound, and now to the U.S. dollar, each currency has dominated its era, only to be replaced when the system became too unsustainable. Today, as the U.S. dollar teeters on the brink, the world is starting to realize that financial independence from the dollar is possible. The recent moves by China and other nations are signs of the beginning of the end for the dollar's dominance. As alternative currencies and financial systems emerge, the writing on the wall is clear. America's empire is entering the final phase of its 80-year debt cycle.
America's empire isn't collapsing all at once. It's happening in stages, and we are now in the final chapter. The U.S. dollar is on the brink of losing its status as the global reserve currency, the very system that has propped up the nation's financial power for decades. The Federal Reserve's reckless printing of money is causing the dollar to lose its purchasing power. We've seen inflation skyrocket in the past few years, and the situation is only getting worse. This inflation is stripping away the wealth of ordinary Americans. The shift to a multipolar financial system means the end of American economic dominance and the beginning of a new era where the dollar will no longer hold the power it once did.
But the devaluation of the dollar isn't just an economic crisis. It's a political crisis, too. As the United States loses its financial edge, its political power will slip as well. The world no longer sees the U.S. as an undefeated economic powerhouse. Instead, they see a nation that has become a debt-ridden giant with its own financial collapse in the making. The falling dollar will trigger a series of political shifts worldwide. Nations that once relied on American financial hegemony are already starting to distance themselves, making deals with rivals like China and Russia. These countries are positioning themselves for a world where the U.S. dollar no longer holds the same influence it once did.
The inevitable result of this debt cycle is that America will reach a point where it must choose between two impossible options: raise interest rates to curb inflation, which will bankrupt the government, or keep printing money, which will accelerate the currency collapse. This is the classic fiscal dominance trap that every empire has faced. The moment the government spends more on interest payments than on national security, the empire stops functioning as a sovereign entity. It starts to feed on itself, borrowing more and more just to keep the lights on. This is how nations go from being superpowers to being zombie debtors, and America is walking this path right now.
As history shows us, the solution to this debt crisis is always the same: currency devaluation. When an empire reaches its breaking point, it resorts to printing money to escape the impossible debt burden. But this doesn't solve the problem. It just delays the inevitable. Eventually, the paper wealth built up through currency expansion evaporates, leaving the public with worthless money. And at the end of every empire's debt cycle, hard assets like gold, land, and productive industries become the only things of real value. The wealth transfer from the middle class to the elite accelerates, and the power shift becomes irreversible.
This is exactly what happened to the Dutch Empire centuries ago. As the Dutch guilder collapsed, the financial center of the world shifted from Amsterdam to London, where the British Empire took over. But as history repeated itself, the British eventually fell victim to the same cycle. After the Second World War, the British government was forced to dismantle its imperial system, and the U.S. dollar emerged as the global currency. The same story is now unfolding for the United States, and the dollar's time at the top is running out. Just like the Dutch and British before it, the United States is sacrificing its financial stability to maintain its global power. This is where the death cross begins to appear. The government is borrowing more than it can afford to pay back. Inflation accelerates, the dollar devalues, and the middle class is left with less and less. The question is no longer whether this collapse is coming, it's when. And that when is now. We're already seeing the early signs of this, from the rising debt levels to the declining purchasing power of the dollar. As we approach the final stage of the 80-year debt cycle, there's one crucial factor that makes this situation different from past empires. The global reserve currency is no longer just a tool for domestic trade. It is the foundation of the global economic system. The world's entire financial infrastructure is built around the U.S. dollar. But this is changing fast. Countries like China, Russia, and India are already building the systems that will bypass the dollar, creating their own financial rails. They're actively de-dollarizing, reducing their dependency on the U.S. currency.
The reality is this: America's financial system is unsustainable. The U.S. debt will continue to climb, the dollar will continue to lose value, and the wealth gap will keep growing. The only question is when the rest of the world will turn away from the U.S. and create a system that doesn't rely on an empire in decline. Just like the British Empire fell after decades of overextending its power, America is now entering the same dangerous territory. But unlike the British, the American empire may not have time to rebuild before the endgame arrives.
So what happens when this cycle finally ends, when the debt bomb explodes and the US dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency? The answer is not an immediate collapse, but rather a slow, agonizing slide into financial irrelevance. It will start with inflation that gets worse every year as the U.S. prints more money to service its crushing debt. The middle class will feel the squeeze, watching their savings lose value while the wealthy elite profit from assets that continue to rise in value. And when the next financial crisis hits, the U.S. will be left without the power to control it. The world is moving on. Geopolitical rivals are preparing their systems to bypass the dollar, and America's political and financial leaders seem content to ignore the ticking clock. The shift away from the US dollar will accelerate, and America will be left to deal with the consequences. The very system that made America great will be the very system that drags it into decline.